Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for our daily Bible study. I'm James. This is Aid. We're up to episode 205 and 1 Samuel chapter 9. Make sure to read through your copy of 1 Samuel 9 at home. Here's my personal summary of the chapter. At this point, we're now introduced to Saul. So the action is sort of shifting from Samuel being the center of the action, the ark, and Samuel in the first half of the chapter, to now specifically to Saul, the son of Kish. We're told he's tall and handsome. And one day, Saul, along with one of the family's servants, went looking for his father's lost donkeys all throughout the territory of the tribe of Benjamin. They had been searching long enough that Saul said they should probably turn back, or his father was going to begin worrying about them. But Saul's servant recommended seeking advice from the man of God in that town. So they agreed to go to the man of God and offer him a gift of a quarter shekel of silver for some advice. Along the way, they met some women who told Saul where to find the man of God. And the day before, God had told Samuel, the man of God himself, that a man from Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, would be coming to visit, and Samuel should anoint this guy, Saul, as king to deliver Israel from the Philistines. When Samuel saw Saul, God told him that Saul was the guy who was going to be the king. Saul asked Samuel who the seer, the great man of God, the prophet of Israel, was, and Samuel said, "It's me." Then he informed Saul that all of his donkeys that were lost 3 days ago had now been found, and he told Saul to stay with him that day. Samuel said that all of Israel was soon going to turn to Saul for guidance, but Saul said that he was just from a little clan in the smallest tribe in Israel, and it didn't make any sense for him to lead anybody. But Samuel seated Saul at the head of a table for this banquet that he had in a hall of 30 people, where they were celebrating a feast, specifically like anticipating Saul's coming. Samuel had prepared a feast to anoint Saul and set a select portion of meat, like a kingly portion of meat, in front of him. The next day, Samuel told Saul to send his servant on ahead, but that Saul should stay there for a few days so that Samuel might share with him a message from God. And that's 1 Samuel 9. Devotional thoughts for the day. Make sure I'm properly ready to go here. Thank you. 1 Samuel 9, devotional thought 1, intro to Saul. So we probably just need to do a brief rundown of who like the main human character in this is all going to be for the next rest of this book, really. Because the action has shifted from Samuel to Saul now. We learn 1, Saul is tall and handsome, which, okay, is a physical description necessary, only probably insofar as that Saul is the type of guy, he looks like the part. He looks like the type of guy that you would want as a leader in your nation. And we're told he's head and shoulders taller than most everybody else. He's good looking. He's athletic. He's, like the kind of like figurehead that you want as representative of your nation. Number 2, he's from a little clan in the small tribe of Benjamin. Number 3, we know that his family at least had some wealth, and we can infer that from some of the details of this chapter. They own land, they own animals, and his family has family servants. All of that suggests some wealth in the family. Number 4, he's kind of likably modest. He doesn't see himself as a king, which is kind of a nice trait. And he very clearly is kind of persistent and hardworking. He's concerned about what his dad thought. Is my dad going to be worrying about me when we're gone all this time? I'm concerned about the family business. I want to make sure to find these donkeys. All of those he seems like a respectable, honorable, relatively modest and hardworking young guy. And I think that's, where we start. Any impressions of Saul as a leader?
I feel like it's like a fake modesty.
Okay.
So, yeah, he's kind of talking about how wealthy his dad is, right? He's kind of falsely, modestly saying, like, I come from the smallest. Well, why was it the smallest tribe? Because they were disobedient to God, and a lot of their numbers were destroyed.
Okay, yep. Benjamin has some history of some of that, yeah.
So I feel like it's like a false modesty, and he's not really taking responsibility for like his people.
Interesting.
When we watched the Bucks game last night, and granted I don't watch a lot of football or whatever, but
basketball.
or yeah, see, they were interviewing someone after the game from the team that lost, and he had his like hoodie like way up around his face, and I said, I don't think that seems very professional. And someone who was over said, yeah, it's not. It's, you know, that's part of what he gets paid for, is he needs to just sit up and take ownership of, like, this is how I played, this is what happened, this is where we go moving forward. But it was like, you could just tell how, and I get it, it's tough if you think you're seen as a failure on like a national stage or whatever.
Yeah.
Which I don't think anyone was even looking at him that way, but it was like a losing team. So I get it, it's tough, but I think sometimes you have to take you just have to take, responsibility of, of like your shortcomings,
Yeah, so, and I don't, it's hard.
I feel like it was like an I don't deserve to be king. Like, would it, like.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's hard to tell. Certainly Saul eventually adjusts to this role and seems perfectly fine with it eventually. Mm-hmm. You know, he settles into being king and actually goes beyond what he should be doing as king at times. And so it's hard to, but whether or not that power is corrupting him, the power has the potential to corrupt anybody. He seems, from a superficial perspective, I think he seems relatively modest and obedient and hardworking, but you're right, there might be some false modesty. Usually there is some false modesty under the surface of.
Well, and you can tell by, I think, the way, his character ended up being.
Yeah, that it wasn't totally pure Okay, so devotional thought number 2 then, Saul's spiritual background. This is kind of interesting too, because Saul lives in a town called Gibeah. It's only 5 miles from Ramah, which is the place that we were also previously told that Samuel lived. And 1 Samuel 3:20 specifically says all Israel recognized Samuel as the prophet of the Lord. But Saul apparently has no knowledge of Samuel. Mm-hmm. So there's some kind of disconnect there between Saul's family and what seems to be common knowledge spiritually in Israel. Mm-hmm. It required actually Saul's servant to tell him that a prophetic man of God lived just a few miles away and that they could visit him and ask for some advice. And evidently, we get the impression that Saul's family did not attend the annual feasts in Israel. They weren't overly concerned about spiritual matters. It doesn't seem like he's hostile towards spiritual matters, but it seems like he's, it's a farming family. He's interested in the family business. He's caught up in that, and he just hasn't given a whole lot of thought, and his family hasn't given a whole lot of thought to matters of God. And I think in some respects, what you find there is somebody who's kind of characteristic of a lot of young adults today. Mm-hmm. I think the general feeling I get from working with young adults who are sort of outside of the church is not so much that they just are hostile to and hate the church or hate God or hate God's word or anything like that. They're just kind of apathetic towards it. Mm-hmm. They don't see the pragmatism in them, doesn't immediately see the value and the benefit of it. And they're just, I think, in other words, I think Saul in some ways represents what I perceive as a lot of young adults in America today. Do you think that's fair characterization or not?
Yeah, there's just so many other things going on in that time period that if you weren't raised in the church, it's easy to not think about it unless someone brings it to your attention. Yeah, he's
attractive, he's moral.
Plus there's such an air today of you do you, whatever you do is fine. But I'm just gonna do whatever I want to do. Yeah,
total right. Yeah, there's I have something against that, but that's not my life right now. Mm-hmm. He's attractive. He's moral. He's busy. He's respects other people, but he has very little understanding of spiritual matters.
Yeah,
and I think that's where I'd characterize. It's not malicious. It's just. Some apathy and some, ignorance I know is kind of a loaded, but lack of awareness of spiritual matters of God, I think.
Well, I don't understand why God chose him.
Yep. It's the same question as why did God choose us? We get this again and again. We know that sometimes God specifically chooses the weak and the little to shame the proud. So oftentimes this is the David choice, right? The next king is going to be the runt of the family litter. But why does he choose Saul to begin with? I think, at least to me, in some respects, he's choosing Saul to set up his choice to David, like as a contrast. But, why specifically Saul? It's a little hard to say. Devotional thought number 3, then, God's providence. The things that had to happen for this meeting to take place are actually kind of interesting. So remember, Saul has lost his donkeys. How that happens, I didn't know that like donkeys necessarily wandered off.
Oh, they have a mind of their own.
Well, I know they're stubborn, but the idea that they are just like looking for a wild time.
And my Bible said a donkey was like the pickup truck of the Israelites.
Yeah.
Like no matter how poor you were, everyone had one because it was pretty much a necessity for doing anything.
It's a beast of burden. It's transportation, but it's also
so to have multiple donkeys would really be it's like having multiple cars in your garage. Yep.
It's a status of wealth kind of thing. But again, the idea, I didn't know, I've never heard of anything being common that they would wander off.
The more you have, the harder it is to
keep track.
To manage it all.
Right. So yes, if they have 20 at home and 5...
Let that be a lesson to us all.
Get your house and your donkeys in order. So he loses his donkeys. The servant, so they've been wandering around for 3 days. The servant says... Which is, again, we get this a couple times in the Bible, too, where it's like the servant girl or the servant guy who has to tell the person that they're serving, like, well, yeah, but God can take care of this, or God, there's a man of God that, can speak to this. Anyways, the servant is the one that knows there's a man of God nearby in the town of Ramah. Again, only 5 or so miles away from where Saul was originally. God at the same time goes to Samuel and says, tomorrow I'm going to bring a guy into your life. He's going to wander into your life, and he's going to be the one who's the next, like the king of Israel. To such an extent that Samuel's confident in this that he sets up a big banquet meal, invites 30 guests, and it seems to be like this, like at the top of a mountain, they're holding this feast in honor of celebrating the new king of Israel. And he's never even met Saul, and Saul just kind of wanders into his life. And it shows, so when we talk about God's providence, his sovereign control over all the things in the universe, not just his ability to work things out for good, although that's part of it. It's his ability to, he's Lord over every molecule in the universe. And when you think about it, okay, so his power extends all the way down to knowing and controlling the thoughts of donkeys to accomplish his purposes. So he's not just Lord over believers, he's not just Lord over humans, he's actually Lord over very clearly all the animals too, to such an extent that he can cause animals to, how did this happen? How do donkeys wander off? The final answer to this is God caused them to wander off. And so I think understanding that he has that level of control of detail. So when we worry about things like our investments and how much can I control the stock market, or when we worry about our health and how much can I control every individual cell in my body, I do the best I can to manage it wisely to honor God. But at the end of the day, the one who's in control of everything, including the thoughts of the donkeys, is God.
Yeah, it's hard to know how much you should be doing and how much you should just be trusting God.
Yeah.
Should I not be putting... I don't know, my friend just convinced me to switch to aluminum-free deodorant, which I don't find to be as effective, but supposedly I won't get breast cancer. I
don't either.
I don't know. So everyone knows, smoking clearly has very negative health outcomes. But I think in years to come, we'll find out there were so many other things that we did, whether it was pesticides or whatever.
Laptops and cell phones and...
Yes. Yeah. Someone was just telling me about a lady who was a marathon runner, and she would put her cell phone...
in her pocket.
She had to hold her, against her side, and she ended up getting breast cancer in that exact location where her cell phone had been for all the miles she had ran.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that. So and with investments too. I hate looking at our investments. I want to just stick my head in the sand.
Yeah.
And be I'm not, it stresses me out so much because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
I don't know what's good or what's not good as far as growth. Yeah. And there's literally nothing I can do about it. So a situation like that, I just want to avoid, which I know also isn't a correct attitude. So sometimes it's hard to know how much you should be doing and how much you should just be trusting God to do.
Yeah.
Like, you want to make the most of every opportunity He gives you, but so, like, should I have been perfectly fine being a nurse? So one time I was talking about that I was a little concerned moving up an income bracket when you go from a bedside nurse to an advanced practice nurse. You're going to go up in income. I said I'm a little concerned, like when you have more to manage, sometimes it's more difficult to manage properly.
Yep. Do you have the right heart to manage that?
And that person said to me, well, you could just stay a nurse then. Like, I don't see what's wrong with that. And I think at the time I was a little little taken aback, because in my mind I always think, like, if you have the capacity or the capability to do something, especially something not a lot of other people can do, something that would benefit other people, I almost think it would be negligent of me not to take that opportunity.
You have a responsibility to it.
Yeah, yes. But I know not everyone thinks that way, and there would have been nothing wrong with staying a bedside nurse.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question of, okay, I could do more, but do I have the heart to manage? Like, so being able to do more is not just physically could I, but do I have the right attitude, temperament, heart, family situation to do more? Like, that's a different part of the managing. And it's part of the idea that, like, in Christian stewardship, God makes us managers of a lot of important things. Our bodies, our family, our spiritual life, our career or work, our all that. So we're trying to it's an attitude thing, I think. You're not in control of everything. God is, but you're not responsible for nothing because God has entrusted some things to your care. That's the parable of the talents, where the servant just buries the talent and God says, what are you doing? I gave you stuff to manage wisely. And so, like, the Christian, that sweet spot in there is the idea, not I'm in control and not I don't have any responsibility, but I have some things to manage. And you're just trying to manage that in a way that is glorifying God and serving other people, not being about me and not falling into either one of those pits.
Yeah, it's just difficult.
It is.
And then also, this is kind of a different note, but my Bible says often, and I definitely do this, but it says oftentimes we think events just happen to us. Like, I always think everything, like, just happens. Like, oh, it's just an accident. Just happened to us. But as we learn from this story about Saul, God can use common occurrences to lead us where He wants. So it's very important to evaluate all situations as potential divine appointments designed to shape our lives. Think of all the good and bad circumstances that have affected you lately. Can you see God's purpose in them? Perhaps He's building a certain quality in you or leading you to serve Him in a new area.
That was actually my application point for this question, is to what extent should Christians try to, like, one thing I hear from a lot of Christians is they'll say something like, that was totally a God thing.
Yeah.
And I never want to, like, tamp down on that, like that they're recognizing God's hand and God's grace in their life. That's an excellent thing. But I also think to myself sometimes too, like, well, do I know for sure? To what extent can I know for sure that is God versus something else? I think if you understand that every good thing that happens to you is ultimately God, like every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of the heavenly lights. Every good thing is from God. Then I think it's probably appropriate to regularly say when something good happens, totally a God thing. But I think we also, believing what I believe about, like, sola scriptura, that, the Bible itself is the thing that we can authoritatively say as, like, God spoke this. This is God's authoritative word, versus a situation that turned out a certain way and saying, like, that is God's authoritative hand. Like, to me, there's levels of being able to say, like, that was God's doing. But I don't know.
Well, you just said it's all God's doing, even the animals.
A good thing. Right.
No, click back one point. You said God controls the animals.
Well, yeah, but so, again, that's balanced with the idea that God doesn't control sins in the sense that He doesn't force us to sin. That's our doing.
Yeah.
So it's a balance in there somewhere. I think, as a general rule, my where I've kind of fallen on this is I think it's a great thing for Christians to look for God's hand in their life and to celebrate God things that happen, like undeserved goodness, where they're seeing God just be generous with them, unexpectedly, undeservedly, that kind of thing. And I think so long as they understand that it should never go against anything that's revealed in His Word.
What about bad things?
Yeah. it's kind of like when we sing, I know you don't sing it all that often, but it's a hymn that I grew up with. What God ordains is always good, which is kind of a famous Christian hymn. But the idea is either God makes it happen or God allows something to happen. But in either case, for the believer, he works all things out for good. And that's been an important insight for me too. Romans 8:28, God works all things for the good of those who love him. It doesn't say all things are good. Anything that good that we get is from God, but it says God can take all things, including bad things, and work them out for good. So, like, is God ordaining it or not? In a sense, yes and no. He's allowing it because he intends to bring good from it.
So in anesthesia, people always say, I've heard anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists who've been practicing a long time say, like, this is a really humbling profession. Like, it's a humbling profession.
Yeah.
And I obviously haven't been doing it that long or have a ton of experience or am by any means an expert, but I hate it. So like if I can't get someone intubated, like if they have a difficult airway, or if I can't get an epidural working for a mom, I hate that. I feel like I'm a failure. I look stupid.
Yeah.
And people will say like, everyone's anatomy is different. Like sometimes it's just a difficult airway. Like sometimes, you know, even like experienced people sometimes will say, I couldn't get it and I asked someone to help me. Like it's a different set of eyes, a different whatever. It's a humbling profession. But sometimes I think things like that happen. So just when I think I've like mastered one skill, someone comes along where I can't get whatever.
Yeah.
And then I'm crushed. And it's always a good reminder to me, I think, like, Aid, what are you, like, is your entire identity wrapped up on being proficient?
How good am I at this? Yeah.
Yeah, or being seen as capable or good.
Yep.
Yeah. So sometimes I think that God allows those things to happen. To keep me humble or dependent on him, or not to think like, oh, look what I can do. I can do anything.
God can ordain that too. And even though we might in the moment perceive it as bad, we can recognize it as for our spiritual good when we kind of our thinking sobers up a little bit. Yeah. Yep, I totally agree with that too. But yeah, the idea that God is, again, just keeping in mind that he even controls the minds of the donkeys, is every last detail, every square inch, every cell in your life, Jesus is the Lord over. And therefore, not to worry about them too much, not to worry about outcomes too much, but just trying to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness and be faithful in managing whatever you got. And it'll work out the way it's supposed to at that point. All right, you ready to close with prayer? Lord God, thank you for our time in study today. Thank you also for your sovereign control, your providence over all things. The fact that you work out all things for our good doesn't mean that we love everything we experience, but it means that we know good is coming from it, because you either intended it to happen or you allowed it to happen because you intended good to even come from things that we perceive as bad. And that makes you good in ways that are incomprehensible to us. So thank you for your constant goodness to us. Forgive us for getting upset when things don't go our way. Keep us humble. Keep us full of worship. Keep us grateful and hopeful. And Lord, help us to see very clearly and praise you for the fact that everything that happens in our life, you're totally in control of, so we have no reason to worry. And may our calmness glorify you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks again for studying with us. We'll see you next time for 1 Samuel chapter 10.